Okay, so good evening, everyone. Welcome to another evening with Bible and Ancient Texts. And tonight, what we're going to be looking at is Sheol, the afterlife, the biblical view, and in the context of the ancient Near East. Now, I'm going to start with kind of an overview of the biblical view. Then we're going to look at the ancient text, and then we're going to go back to the biblical text. Okay. Now, in general, and this is important to note, this is actually interesting. I saw a clip online of a show about gangsters in England. And what is it called? It has a weird name. But anyway, so it's about gangsters in England. And I just saw a clip of it, and they coming, and it's you know it's not the cleanest language, but you know they're coming, and there's this older guy, and he's apparently been pretending he's dead, and he's now been found out, and he's like, yeah, have you ever read? He's like, oh, where we're going? He's like, have you ever read this book? And he holds up a Tanakh. Yes, Peaky Blinders. Thank you, Robin. Peaky Blinders. I was watching a clip of Peaky Blinders, and this guy who went into hiding, he holds up, have you read this book? And he holds up, I'm expecting a Holy Bible to say Holy Bible on it. No, it's Tanakh. It says Tanakh. It's like Torah and Nevi'im. It's like a Tanakh. It's a Tanakh, a Hebrew Tanakh. He holds up this Hebrew Tanakh, and he says, have you read this? Where we're going? You know, this has lots about where we're going. We're going to a horrible place. And I'm thinking like, okay, guys, you kind of got one thing right. I mean, he's Jewish, so you gave him a Hebrew Tanakh. I personally would doubt that a Jewish guy in England at that period would be just reading a straight Hebrew Tanakh with no English translation, but I don't know enough about the history of like how early they printed the English translation, but it's a little strange to me. That aside, no, you can read the whole Tanakh, you can read all the Hebrew Bible, you're not going to get anything about hell. Like you're not going to learn a whole heck of a lot. I mean, you're going to learn very, very little, right? That's not the book that you think it is, right? It's not the book you think it is. You're thinking of a different Bible, right? The Hebrew Bible does not go into hell. It does have mentions. It does have mentions of kind of where you go after death. And they're very broad mentions. We're going to come back to this later and see it inside. It's very much it's a one-way street, right? You go to Sheol. You know what? Let's actually start with the biblical text. Let's start with the biblical text instead of just talking about it. I'm going to share my screen. Is this a question? No. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen. Give me just a moment here. Here we go. Okay. All right. This is not what I wanted. Here we go. Okay, so let's see. Let's take a look at a very famous reference to Sheol. Now, Sheol, which is the place where dead people go, right? There's Sheol. It's also called Shachat. It's also sometimes just called Mavet, death. So here's a classic. Here's a classic line when Yaakov is saying, I'm not going to let Binyamin go with you guys to get wheat from Egypt because, you know, Yosef went and he, you know, as he says, Vayomer lo yered b'ni imachem, he said, my son will not go down with you. Ki achiv met v'hu levado nishar, because his brother Yosef, right, was dead, and he is left alone. Ukra'ahu ason baderech asher telchuva, and some disaster will befall him on the path that you go. V'horadtem et sevati be'agon she'ola, and you shall bring me down with my gray hairs in my old age. You will bring me down, grief-stricken, to the grave, to Sheol, which is not only the grave. Sheol is where dead people go after they die. Okay. Now, I've said elsewhere, I've talked a little bit about what is the ason, right? What is this disaster that might befall Binyamin, and why specifically him? And this hints to the idea that while Yaakov had to recognize the bloody clothing as belonging to Yosef and kind of legally recognize that his brothers could not be held responsible for his death, that suspicion probably continued. And so this ason, he's worried about another kind of just crazy circumstance is just going to happen to kill Binyamin when Binyamin is out with the brothers. But bring it back to here, so we see that this idea that Yaakov is that everyone dies, but the idea is by taking away my son, the Yaakov will go down in grief to the grave. First of all, he'll kill him early, but he'll also be grieving for his son. Let's take a look at a few other sources. So here we have, here is Hosea talking about the sinning of Israel. Miyad Sheol efdem mimavet egalem, right? Shall I redeem them from the hand of Sheol? From death shall I save them, right? And so you see that it's Ehi dvarecha mavet. It's more like he says, "Ho thy plagues, O death! Ho thy destruction." I guess if he, so comes as a woe, woe, and again, it's a little bit, it's hard. It's not necessarily, you could say, is it dvarecha? Does it mean like dever, which would be a plague? Does it mean your words, what you're doing, your things that you're dealing, your contemplation, your words, or whatever you're doing is death, right? And your destruction is Sheol, but that Sheol and death are used synonymously. And that kind of shows us also that the idea of Sheol is not, it's not super specific. Like you wouldn't use hell and death synonymous. I guess you could, you would if you're talking to an iniquitous person, right? But Sheol is where everyone goes. Sheol is where everyone goes. Let's take a look at a few other sources. Here we have, oh, this is not just all of them, hold on. Here we are, right? This is Proverbs. This is Mishlei. Okay, this is Mishlei, Parak Lamed, Proverbs chapter 30. Okay, and now I'm gonna have to find my place again. The three things that can't be. Three things. Let's take a look. Hold on. And now I lost my place. Sorry about this. 3 things which are too wonderful. 3 things are this quake. And of course, now I'm not going to find it. Guys, stop me if you see me pass through it. Here we are. Okay, there are 3 things that are never satisfied. Shalosh hena lo tisbana, right? 3 things are never satisfied. Arba lo amru hon, 4 that never said enough, right? Or were full, right? Sheol v'otzaracham, eretz lo sab amayim, ve'esh lo amrahon. The grave in the barren womb, the land that can never have enough water, which you can tell where this is written, right? There are places where land can sure have enough water, but not in this area. In this area, you don't see that. Ve'esh lo amrahon, and fire, right? It doesn't say enough. Now here it's actually a question. So it's death. It's interesting that death is paired with barrenness, right? So that's kind of the both sides. There's on the one hand death, and on the other hand the non-birth, right? Non-birth is also something that never ends, which is, it's very sad. And so Sheol here, and this is a theme that we see, I'll show it to you in just a bit in Habakkuk. Death is like this gaping maw that is never satisfied. Sheol, right? Sheol, but it's death, right? Death is never satisfied. It always wants more. Sheol, you could call it the grave, you could call it the pit, right? It's also called shachat, right? It's never satisfied. Here we have another, in Habakkuk, we have another example of this idea. Here we are. Asher hirchiv kish'ol nafsho v'hu chamavet lo yispa. And he widens his like Sheol. His nafsho probably here is throat, right? Actually, here it says his desire. I guess you could say this because it's talking about this guy who is puffed up and evil and wicked, right? And wicked guy, right? Gever Yahir, right? So you could say his soul like has widened like death. But it also could just be saying that he's opened his like throat, you could say wide to swallow like death, right? He will never be satisfied like death. Like he just takes it all in. Okay, you can say it either way. I suppose in the context, perhaps it is more correct actually to say show that it's his spirit is like, I don't know, maybe it's a play on words in terms of the swallowing like death, right? So there's this idea that Sheol and death are things that are never satisfied. And you see here again, the Sheol is just used as a parallel. Now, Yechezkel has a few places where he kind of more describes what it is to die. Usually when he's talking about kings. I was actually looking before, here we are. Here he's threatening the king of Tsor, of Tyre. And he says, they'll bring you down to the pit, right? Vamata mimotei chalal belev yamim, and you shall die the death of the slain people in the heart of the sea. Heart of the sea, because of course the people of Tyre were merchants, and that's where they got their wealth. And also, of course, that's where they had that's where their forces were strongest for obvious reasons. I did want to find, there's one place where he's a little bit more specific. Here's another place. Let me find it. Again, he's promising destruction to Tyre. This is one of Yechezkel's problematic prophecies. Let's see if I can. Yeah, so here it's v'horadaticha et yordei vor el am olam, and I will bring you down like those who go down to the pit, to the people of old, people who've been there forever. People have been there forever. V'oshavtich be'eretz tachtiot kacharavot me'olam, and I will have you dwell in the nether regions, right? Like these places that are destroyed, that are ruins, at your devor, with the people who go down to the pit. Leman lo teshevi. Okay, so that you will not dwell. It will so actually rather I think it's that area shall not be inhabited. And you see, and the idea is, and there's I was trying to find the place in Yechezkel where I was not able to. There's a place where he describes a little bit more that, the warriors are lying there with their spears, right? And everyone essentially goes down to Sheol. Everyone goes down to the pit. This is where they end up. And the idea is that on the one hand, this is, everyone goes there. There isn't what we see biblically. I like your background, Robin. Very nice. What we see biblically is that there's not much importance to details of what happens in the afterlife, right? There's just not. It's this kind of pit. Everyone goes there. Kings go there. Warriors go there, and that's it. That's it. It sounds like it sucks. It sounds like it's kind of underground. It doesn't sound like fun, and that's where everyone goes. You can say to God, please save me from death. Please save me from shachat, right? But that's pretty much as far as it goes. There isn't much like, and when I die, give me, a really nice cut of meat. Like, you don't have that sort of thing in biblically. Right? You don't have that idea. And even when if you say a lot of people point to Yechezkel and the dry bones in terms of, and there are, in terms of the approach to the afterlife, and this is important also because that I do a lot of stuff from the Second Temple period, from Beit Sheni. And once you get there actually becomes, then you start having the question of, okay, are they interested? What do they think happens to human souls after they die? Because for some of them, they're just kind of in a holding pattern until the day of judgment. In other words, the really wicked ones, maybe they get punished. Certainly wicked angels get punished. The wicked people maybe get punished. The righteous people don't get really a reward. They're just kind of waiting around till Judgment Day. In a lot of these Second Temples, they're waiting around till Judgment Day, and then there's Judgment Day, and then they get everything wonderful, and it seems like, and then they're supposed to return to Earth, right? Or there's actually one version where the entire Earth is destroyed, like really all of the Earth is destroyed. It's like enough earth, no more earth, right? And the righteous people can like live not on earth, and then there's no more earth, real apocalypse, right? But in general, this idea that is so taken for granted now, right? That Judaism has this hell and heaven, and let's face it, it's not even that much in the rabbinic sources. I'm not saying it's not there at all, right? When I was a kid, when I was in 3rd grade, and our teacher told us about the hot Gehenna and the cold Gehenna, right? He was the same guy who told us about the Hamantash State Manhattan. And we put it pretty much in the same category. Like, it was a fun story. Like, he was making a big deal of it. We're like, wow, this is fun to hear about. But we weren't trembling in our boots. We weren't trembling in our boots. And it's not because I was a particularly, stoic kid. One thing that did, so for example, a story that did make me tremble, just as an aside, and I heard later, I think it's actually a Chabad thing. I was going to a Chabad school. I think it was a Chabad thing. They said, so you're praying, you're davening, right? And of course, you're a little kid, you make mistakes. And they're like, okay, every word becomes an angel that goes up to God. So that's lovely. What a lovely idea. They're like, and all of the angels, I don't know who told me this even. I think I was a teacher. When you mess up, let's say you double up, you say double. So like the angel comes out with like 3 eyes. And if you skip, you keep on, like the angel's missing an arm. And then, I don't remember if it was Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, they go on a parade before God and they're like, look what she's done. That terrified me. It terrified me. That's horrible. That is horrible, right? Right? Like, and who, you're a kid, of course you make mistakes. I don't know who had the brilliant idea to have the story. I don't, my parents didn't know, they told it to me, and I've never seen it anywhere else. I think it's not a common thing, but that certainly instilled the fear of God. I now I can tell the story and laugh. I mean, if I think about it, if I believe it, yes, it's horrible. I mean, it's a horrible thing, like, but I don't believe it, right? So but the thing is, so like the idea of hell and its denizens, and like the idea that there are demons in hell, that's certainly not a Jewish idea. You really don't see that. And in fact, in Christianity, you can actually trace when the angels who are in charge in hell became demons, right? There's actually kind of like a flip. It's wasn't, it's interesting because all of these things are developments, right? But in Judaism, hell is just not that big a deal. And heaven is a little bit more of a deal, but it only becomes a deal after kind of the biblical canon is closed, right? So the idea that righteous people go up to heaven and they eat, I'm wondering now, I'm thinking what there is in because they're always point to Eov, right? With the eating the shor habar, with the eating the, how do you even translate shor habar? The ox, the great ox that, righteous people get to eat. So anyway, so ideas of the afterlife really only developed strongly in terms of Jewish tradition and then later Christian tradition after the Hebrew Bible. So let's look at actually what there is in the ancient Near East, and we'll know what to compare it with, and so we can see what the context is. I see there's some questions and comments. Is there any reason to understand these examples, meaning the examples of Sheol and Shachat, etc., as meaning anything more than a grave or a pit, as opposed to some sort of underworld where dead people live? Where there is a chapter in Yechezkel where he actually seems to describe it as a place where the dead people are. And here, and then other chapter in Yechezkel where I showed you where he says, you're going to go down and you're going to be where all the people who lived way back when, where all of them are, right? So in other words, there are people who live, quote unquote, in the pit. So right, is it a grave when he says you're gonna make me go down in grief, Sheola, to Sheol, right? So is that just the grave, or is that something that they believe that people that there's some kind of existence? And the fact is, we do have to take each source separately, right? So with Yechezkel specifically, with Ezekiel specifically, remember the Yechezkel is living in Babylonia. And he's absolutely, there's a lot of stuff that he does and that he kind of refers to where it seems that he really is working in a Babylonian cultural context, where the people he's talking to are also familiar with certain Babylonian images and ideas and names. So it's very possible that he's drawing from that the more common Babylonian idea, which is, yeah, it sucks, everyone goes there, but you have a continued existence there. Right? So Yechezkel is the one where we can really point to and say, okay, he sees the continued existence. It is true that in other cases where we see the term used, it could also simply mean death or the grave. Okay, good question and good point. So let's look at some ancient Near Eastern sources. I will once more share my screen. Let me open my PDF first. Okay. Here we are. Okay, here we are. So what I decided to do with this is I would like to start with some Egyptian text. Now, Egyptian text, it's interesting because Egypt, of course, has a much more developed idea of what happens after one dies. They have, and I didn't bring these texts, but there are different pyramid texts, etc., that where the king turns into a god in the underworld. And you could say, well, that's very specific for kings, even though, again, Yechezkel makes the point that all kings end up in the same place. And there is an idea in the biblical thing that everyone ends up dead. Like everyone ends up the same, right? Better a live dog than a dead lion, right? So that death is the same for everyone. In Egypt, that's certainly not true, right? Kings are supposed to be able, like they have these texts that they become a god in the underworld, but not just kings, So let's take a look at our first source. In your handout, this is on the second page. This is all taken from Pritchard, Ancient Near Eastern Texts. It was the book that was easiest. It had all the sources that I wanted to bring. So here is the fields of paradise here that you see on the left is, let me close this so we can make it a little bit bigger. Okay. It's describing a place in the underworld. The underworld, it's not really underworld, it's the afterlife. Okay. And I know that central drawer from which Ray issues in the east, its south is the pool of cupboards, etc. And it's like, I am the keeper of the halyard of the boat of the god. I am the oarsman who does not weary in the bark of Ray. I know those two sycamores are turquoise green. There's a field. I know that field of reeds of Ray. And it's describing the idea that there's a field in the afterlife. There's not much to see there, but what I really wanted to bring was the good fortune of the dead. And here we see, and you have the nice introduction carved on the wall of the tomb of Neferhotep at Thebes and dated to the reign of, I believe it's Horemheb, about 1349 to 1319 BCE. The singer with a harp of the gods, father of Ammon, Neferhotep, the triumphant, said, "All ye excellent nobles, the Aeneid of the mistress of life, hear ye how praises are made to the God's Father with homage. I have heard those songs which are in the ancient tombs, and what they tell in magnifying life on earth and in belittling the necropolis. Why is it that such is done to the land of eternity, the right and true, without terrors?" Okay, so it's the real point is at the afterlife, the land of eternity. That's the right of true and true without terrors. That's a paradise, right? Quarreling is its abomination, and there is no one who will raise himself against his fellow. This land, which has no opponent, all our kinsfolk rest in it since the first day of time. They who are to be for millions of millions will all have come to it. There exists none who may tarry in the land of Egypt. There is not one who fails to reach yon place. As for the duration of what is done on earth, it is a kind of a dream. They say, welcome, safe and sound, to him who reaches the west being the afterlife. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second. So what we have here is this idea that the afterlife is great. No arguments in the afterlife, no war in the afterlife. Everyone goes there, but it's terrific. All right. Now, it's not quite that equal. We know they have little, besides the fact that we know of all the stuff that they got buried with them so that they could take them beyond be with them beyond the grave. And they would have like models. You've all seen like the models of little guys rowing boats, and models of people making, making pots and doing all sorts of things in little model houses. And the idea is that this model, I will have the real thing on the other side. They also took little model slaves. They also took these little figurines that had written on them, I'm going to take on this guy's jobs. If you have jobs, the gods have jobs for this guy who's died, I'll do them. I'm going to do them. I'm his stand-in, right? So the idea is that they had people not just to serve themselves, but to do any work that they might be called upon to do in the afterlife. And the idea, and it's not just that it's just a paradise. And now I'm going to share my screen once again. It's that, and here we see a use of the afterlife for moral effect. Okay, I want to take a step back here. Why is the afterlife so important in Judaism and Christianity to the degree that it is important? To the degree that it's important, what is the main importance? Let's say in Jewish theology, what is the main function of the afterlife? What's the importance of the afterlife? Why is it important to believe in an afterlife? Who would like to jump in and say? Anyone?
Reward.
Right. Reward and punishment. Reward and punishment. If you don't have an afterlife, then when is the wicked going to get punished, and when is the righteous person going to get the reward? Because I saw this righteous person's life and it was crap from beginning to end, excuse me. And I saw this wicked person and he was great. He did fantastically. So when are the scales going to right themselves? In the afterlife. That's where things are going to balance out. And that's super important when you look around you and you're like, why is good? The classic question of Tzaddik Viralo, the question of Tzaddik Viralo is, how can evil happen to a good person, right? And the flip side is Rasha V'Tovo, a wicked person where good things happen to him, okay? Now I'm just going to do an aside. Anyone who's familiar with Tanya knows that those terms are used completely different in the Tanya. So I'm not talking about the Tanya now, okay? All right, so this is what the importance of the afterlife is. So we see this actually in ancient Egypt. In ancient Egypt, it has this function, at least to a certain extent. It's very hard to see to what extent exactly, like how much this was used to kind of say, this is why you need to be good. But let me share my screen and we will take a look. Okay, so this is he's calling it the protestation of guiltlessness. It's in the Book of the Dead as well, and I believe there are some other copies as well. So this is, what do you say? He dies, and then he goes before two judges, right? No, it's not two judges. Sorry, it's the Lord of the two justices, which is Osiris, right? So it's the Lord of the two justices, excuse me. Oh, great God, Lord of the two justices, I've come to thee, my Lord. I've been brought that I might see thy beauty. I know thee, I know thy name, etc., etc., etc. And I have come to thee. I have brought thee justice. I have expelled deceit for thee. I have not committed evil against men. I have not mistreated cattle. Keep going. I have not committed sin in the place of truth. I have not known that which is not. I have not seen evil. My name has not reached the master of the bark. I have not blasphemed to God. I have not done violence to a poor man. I have not done that which the gods abominate. I have not defamed a slave to his superior. I have not made anyone sick. I have not made anyone weep. I have not killed. These are all good things. Like, these are things we want this person not to have done. I have given no order to a killer. Okay, this is a little weird. You always say, if you see there's a rule against it, someone's doing it. So apparently this wasn't common enough that this is something you had to say. I have given no order to a killer. I have not caused anyone suffering. I have not cut down on the food income in the temples. I have not damaged the bread of the gods. I have not taken the loads of the blessed dead. I have not had sexual relations with a boy. I have not defiled myself. I have neither increased or diminished the grain net measure. I have not diminished the aurora. I have not falsified the half aurora land, etc., 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 etc. Okay, so he keeps going. And note that we have here what we consider moral rules, as well as things done against a god, right? It's interesting that you have kind of, I have not blasphemed the God, and then a bunch of moral rules before you get to another thing with where I've not damaged the bread of the gods. But there is certainly a mix of ritual rules and non-ritual rules, and what we call ethical rules, right? And the idea is that he goes and he says, I am pure, 4 times is what he has to say. And then he speaks to Osiris, but also all these different types of evil, what seems to be evil gods. Okay, and he hasn't done anything bad, and he talks about how he hasn't done anything bad, and so what that means is that he is going to get into like the good place, right? He's gonna do well in the afterlife, right? And that is, so we actually see here, this is before we move on to the ancient Near East, before we move on to Samaria, what we see here is that on the one hand, you have this idea that you have this nice afterlife, and it's an afterlife that you can start planning for now and take things along with you. You can take slaves, you can take someone to work for you instead of you. You can take your stuff, right? But there is also, along with that afterlife, a certain moral obligation. Certain moral obligations go along with the idea that you're going to get into the afterlife. Now these in the Book of the Dead and elsewhere, these things are written as kind of an incantation to get you in, right? But one assumes that the idea is that you're not completely lying, right? That you actually have kept up to some kind of moral code. Now, before let me just check and see that there are no questions before I move on. Moshe, this is like an inverted view, right? This is like an inverted, like it's not confessing sins, right? It's saying I haven't done all these things, because the whole point is he wants to get into the good place. And also, again, this is kind of an incantation. And remember, the incantation is like pushing a button for the gods. Like you're like, I'm pushing the button, now let me in. So it's not, I don't think it's completely just pushing a button. I think there is an idea that he actually has not done these bad things. But the point is not to make a confession. The point is to get in, right? The point is I want to get into the good place. And you've all seen the hieroglyphics of his heart being measured against the feather of Mat, right? Which is like truth or justice, right? So, will he get in? There's an idea that morality matters for the afterlife, right? So that is, you're seeing right away, as soon as you have a real description, a real importance to the type of afterlife you get, you see that moral, that connection of, and that's why you need to be moral, which is interesting how that goes together, even early on. So now I'm going to share some things that are closer to what we would consider the biblical context, which is Sumerian and Akkadian myths. I will once more share my screen. Here we go. Okay. Now we're looking at a Sumerian myth, the death of Gilgamesh. The death of Gilgamesh, I want to point out, so we are used to saying Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was a famous hero. You had numerous stories and epics and things about him, right? So we have stuff from Sumer also about Gilgamesh, but the Epic of Gilgamesh, the long multiple tablets that we have and different copies, etc., that's Akkadian. That's from later on. But from Sumer, he's absolutely a character in Sumer. So if we take a look here, this is talking about this is the death of Gilgamesh, and what seems to happen is, let's take a quick look. Here, okay. Oh Lord Gilgamesh, the meaning of the dream is destined thy fate, O Gilgamesh, for kingship, for eternal life he is not destined. In other words, Gilgamesh, you're going to be a king, but you have to die. Okay. But of life be not sad of heart, be not aggrieved, be not depressed. Who of men committed a wrong? The forbidden, thy bond cut loose is not clear. The light and darkness of mankind he has granted thee. Supremacy over mankind he has granted thee. Unmatched something he has granted thee. In other words, look at all you got in life. You got to rule and stuff. Don't be so sad about dying, right? And then what happens, and so here he dies. On the bed of fate he lies, he rises not. On the multicolored couch he lies, he rises not. And then they all mourn him. But he goes, and here I'm reading from the right on the right side. He has offerings, right? Gilgamesh, the son of Ninsun, weighed out their offerings to Ereshkigal, weighed out their gifts to Namtar, weighed out. So he has all these gifts for all these different gods, and Lord Gilgamesh weighed out their bread offerings. And what, let me see if I have the continuation here. Oh, this is not the continuation. So what seems to be is it's possible that after bringing the offerings, he actually is made king in the underworld. All right. But we do see here that there's this kind of mix. So on the one hand, we don't, okay, once you're dead, that's it, right? But it isn't clear, maybe he is going to have some kind of good existence, and he brings offerings to all these different gods. He brings all these offerings to all these different gods, seemingly with the idea going to be that this is going to affect what he gets in the afterlife. This is Sumer. Let's look now at a piece of from later on in a piece of the Akkadian epic of Gilgamesh. Now, in I'm looking here at tablet 7. Okay, so I brought you the beginning of tablet 7. Enkidu has a dream, and then Enkidu is going to die, right? And Enkidu, I'm just going to remind you, Enkidu is Gilgamesh's friend. Enkidu is kind of sent to Earth because Gilgamesh is not being moral, and Enkidu, the kind of the friendship of Enkidu is very important to Gilgamesh. Enkidu, starts out as a wild man, and he gets domesticated. We talked about that in a previous class. And here Enkidu, Gilgamesh's bosom companion, dies. All right. And this is what triggers Gilgamesh's visit to Utnapishtim, who is the Noach of the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? Because Utnapishtim lives forever. He wants to know how, and Utnapishtim tells him the story of the flood and how he got eternal life, right? And then he tells him how to do it, and he essentially loses his chance, and he's not going to be able to cheat death, and he's very sad. So this is a major kind of turning point in the Epic of Gilgamesh when Enkidu dies. All right. Here we go. I'm gonna scroll down to where this here we are. Okay. So and Enkidu it has a similar thing with Enkidu that they see Enkidu and he's not breathing. Enkidu, he almost describes it as if he's never seen death before. Like he's lying there, he's not waking up, he's not breathing. It's like he's never seen death, because it's for Gilgamesh just the realization that someone can die, right? Someone can die, and that's what drives him to search for immortality, which is an interesting idea in general. That there's the first interaction with death is really when one sees the death of a loved one. That's when someone realizes, oh, not like this is something that could happen to me, which is an interesting idea, and I think for many a true idea. So anyway, so here we have a description of death, right? Of what we could say of Sheol, the way, let's say, Yechezkel describes it, or the way Yechezkel kind of hints at it, right? Where it's a place that people go, right? Looking at me, he leads me to the house of darkness, the abode of Irkala, to the house which none leave who have entered it, on the road from which there is no way back, to the house wherein the dwellers are bereft of light, where dust is their fare and clay their food. Okay, it's horrible. They are clothed like birds, with wings for garments, and see no light, residing in darkness. In the house of dust which I entered, I looked at rulers, their crowns put away. I saw princes, those born to the crown, who had ruled the land from the days of yore. These doubles of Enu and Enlil were serving meat roast. They were serving baked meats and pouring cool water from the water skin. So here we have kind of a mix of things, right? So we have, on the one hand, it's a terrible place. There's no light. They eat dust, right? Even rulers are there without their crowns, because it's the great equalizer, right? Death is the great equalizer. And yet now there seems like they're eating meat, right? They're eating meat. And they're drinking water, right? Someone is there. That we have these servants kind of serving meat, and not Anu and Enlil. They shouldn't be servants, but it looks like some of them, at least perhaps the kings, get to eat and drink. All right, eat meat and drink cool water. In the house of dust which I entered, reside high priest and acolyte, reside incantatory and ecstatic, reside the laver anointers of the great gods, resides Atana, resides Sumokan, Eresh Kigal lives there, queen of the netherworld, and Belit Seri, recorder of the netherworld, kneels before her. She holds a tablet and reads out to her. Lifting up her head, she beheld me, saying, who has brought this one thither? Okay, so what's interesting here is you have a queen of the netherworld, right? You have a Reshkigal, you have certain characters that you're expecting. You have the servers of the gods who have apparently died. And it's not what it sounds like is there's an area where these servers of the gods have died and they're still serving. It's not super clear, but there is this idea of death is the great equalizer. This is where everyone goes. It's dusty, it's awful, and it's ruled by a goddess. And there is a certain amount of eating and drinking, right? It's like Hades without the Elysian Fields, really. I mean, Hades is not that different from this sort of thing where everyone goes there, even if you're a great warrior, that's where you end up. And then later on, they're like, well, if you're super good, you go into the Elysian Fields, right? But you start with hell, right? You start with hell. You start with death. You start with the idea that death is the end of the good life, as opposed to the Egyptian approach, which is, why is everyone down on death, right? It's great. No one fights. It's terrific. Okay. Now here I'm going on to one more thing. This is tablet 12, but really it's a different story. Gilgamesh gets a drum, and he somehow drops his drum in the netherworld, in the nether regions, the netherworld, and he's like, oh, I want to go get it. So he goes to get his drum, and he can't get his drum back. Here we have, let me find it. Find it. No. I'm looking. There's absolutely, here we are. Okay, when the spirit of Enkidu, like a wind puff, issued forth from the netherworld, they embraced and kissed each other. They exchanged counsel, sighing at each other. Tell me, my friend, tell me the order of the netherworld which you have seen. I shall not tell you, I shall not tell you. If I tell you the order of the netherworld which I have seen, sit down and weep. I will sit down and weep. My body, which you did touch as your heart rejoiced, vermin devour, as though an old garment. My body, which you did touch as your heart rejoiced, is filled with dust. He cried, woe, and threw himself in the dust. Gilgamesh cried, woe, and threw himself in the dust. What have you seen? I have seen. Okay. So in other words, there's this idea that what have you seen in the underworld? He's essentially seeing everything rotting below below ground kind of thing. It seems. And then if we continue on, him who died a sudden death, have you seen? I have seen. He lies upon the night couch and drinks pure water. He who was killed in battle, have you seen? I have seen. His father and his mother raise up his head, and his wife weeps over him. He whose corpse was cast out upon the steppe, have you seen? I have seen. His spirit finds no rest in the netherworld. He whose spirits has no one to tend them, have you seen? I've seen. Leaves of the pot, crumbs of bread, offals off the street, he eats. And so what this sounds like is, well, no, it's not that everything gets the same. It's not that everyone gets the same thing. It depends on how you died, right? How did you die? Okay, this guy who died a sudden death, he lies upon the night couch and drinks pure water. It sounds like it's okay. He was killed in battle. His father and his mother raise up his head. I think the idea is that he's surrounded by his family. It's not that everyone's weeping over it. It's that he's got his wife to care for him, and his father and his mother, raise up his head. He's got everyone around him, right? He whose corpse was cast out upon the steppe, right? Really abandoned. What have you seen? His spirit finds no rest. He wasn't even buried. And he whose spirit has no one to tend it, what does he do? He eats off the street because he has no one to feed him. All right. So actually what we see here, is a mix of ideas. On the one hand, yeah, it's a horrible place, but what determines? And this is different from the Egyptian thing, where the Egyptian thing is like, look at all these bad things that I haven't done. Okay, let me in. right? And I should get a good life. And also we know, because we, it's not said there, but we know you also prepared all sorts of things for your grave to take with you to the afterlife, and that's going to make your afterlife better. Here, what makes your afterlife better? What makes your afterlife better is how you died and what people are doing after your death. So if the person died and wasn't even buried, then his spirit finds no rest. If he died in battle, then he's got his whole family around him. If he died and there's no one to tend to his corpse after, now we don't know, does that mean that they actually supposed to feed it, or they're supposed to do some kind of ritual for it? It's not clear what they have to do, but he can't, he has nothing to eat. He has nothing to eat in the afterworld. He's there scrounging on the streets, which is pretty crappy for an afterlife. I mean, that is really bad. Like, it's one thing if, like, okay, someone's in mud, but they don't have to eat and drink, but to have to eat and drink and you have no way of getting food, that's pretty horrible. So this is a different approach to having an afterlife, and it's also not a very developed afterlife. It's not the same as the Egyptian afterlife. It's not like, oh wow, well, it's going to be so wonderful. It's a world without strife. It's, there's a limit to what you can expect, and it's all depends on the actual death. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with a person's morality in life, and it's much less developed, and it's just generally crappy. Now, if we go back, to the biblical sources. No, just a second. I see a question. Follow-up. Could it be that life was better in Mesopotamia than in Egypt? In Egypt, life was not bad. I mean, Egypt, life should have been pretty darn good. I mean, we know that the farming practices in Egypt, the reason they could be much more primitive than Mesopotamia was because they had the Nile, right? The Nile overflowed. They had water from the Nile. Everyone lived near the Nile. No one didn't live near the Nile, right? Why would you do that? Right. So you live near the Nile and you have food. Sure, slaves were not going to have a lot of fun, but who hears from them, right? I mean, they're not writing and they're not reading. We don't know about the slaves, right?
Miriam,
Yeah. Yes.
That was a follow-up to the previous question.
Oh, I missed the previous question. Okay, I'm reading the previous question.
There was a question before that too.
Okay, I'm reading now the string of questions. Excuse me. Okay. So first, Moshe Matijah said, what do the Egyptians believe happens to all the people who can't say all those things about how good they were? I think that look, I don't remember, but I think that they go to a bad place. I think that things suck for them. Maybe they're slaves. I know that because there is this kind of servitude. There is a servitude in the afterlife. But what happens if the whole thing with the heart being measured, the heart being balanced against match? So what happens if you fail? I don't remember. I think there's some kind of hell type, a hell equivalent. I think there is. Setting aside, if possible, the next question is from Danny and Libby. Setting aside, if possible, the issue of the evil and the righteous, the wicked and the righteous, I'm wondering to what extent a society's thoughts about the afterlife are a function of its subjective self-perception of its present quality of life or its present predicament. If life in general sucks, then the afterlife can only be better, and vice versa. The problem is I'm a little bit too influenced with modern approaches to religion, right? Where modern approaches to religion say this is a kind of a power play, right? If you have a religion of like the masters and they're going to talk to the slaves about how great the afterlife is and now be slaves, right? And the question is, what do people say about themselves? Look, in Egypt, let's face it, especially with the text from Egypt. I mean, the texts are generally going to be from nobles that we have, are going to be from nobles, are going to be from kings. I've seen it looks like they had fun. Honestly, they have those lotus parties with the wax that drips on their heads and releases like what is it, like opium or something? Like they knew how to have a good time. It looks like they eat. You should see these meals they have, right? They eat like everything, and I think it's telling that when they say how great it is, it's that there's no strife, there's no argument. To me, that's a real indication, because like if I were to describe the afterlife, it wouldn't even occur to me to say, and no one's fighting there, right? but that is a key to the afterlife. Now, to the Rambam, it would, frankly, right? The Rambam said, like, that is a no war, obviously is, right? But I wouldn't even think of that in terms of the afterlife, where this is like, hey, the afterlife is great. No one fights, right? So that does indicate there's a lot of fighting, right? To me, it indicates that that's a crappy part of life that everyone's fighting. And I assume that in court, I could see that there'd be a lot of struggle going on. I don't think the people who were writing these texts in Egypt have such terrible lives. I don't think, in general, the fact that, look, Egypt, not only did they have water, I'm not talking top down, right? I'm not talking about the slaves. I'm talking about top down. They had water, they had gold, which everyone wanted. And everyone was sending their best stuff to get that gold. So, like, what didn't Egypt have? Right. So it's hard for me to believe that Egypt like needed an afterlife. I think, on the contrary, I think there was. I wonder. It now you're making me think in terms of, is there a difference in a moral system that requires an afterlife? Right. Is there some reason that you would need an afterlife to say, and that's why you need to be moral? I think I feel like that would take me though into a much too black and white point of view. Like I feel like it's probably hard to say. And the Egyptians, I mean, the whole Egyptian civilization was so different from the, I mean, they had their own culture, their own civilization, their own religion that developed over so long, over so many generations, that was completely different from what was going on in Mesopotamia. And you know, it's an interesting difference. But I don't want to go too far off. But I really don't think it was a difference in an economic difference. I really don't. Okay. The Chinese have the concept of the hungry ghost, a dead person whose family does not perform the proper rituals, is forced to wander looking for food. Yeah, so this is the same sort of idea, it seems like, that we see in that piece of Gilgamesh, right? That if someone doesn't have someone who's worrying about him, and we have it kind of that's the sort of thing that you would have across the board. That's something that you would kind of expect for any sort of ritual where you're supposed to take care of the dead. So what happens if you don't, right? Again, and if we go back, so let's think a little bit in terms of our biblical text, because this is what now. Obviously, when we look at these Mesopotamian things, we're picking and choosing. We're not seeing, like, there's not a whole heck of a lot, let's say, in Ugaritic texts about this. So I'm not saying it's a little bit of an argument from absence, but here the biblical texts have possibly the least description and the least view of some kind of afterlife, right? They really don't talk about an afterlife and either that death, that the way you die affects it. No, doesn't really, no. Right? There's much more about, like, don't cause impurity of the land, right? Even when Cain kills Hevel, right? So the earth cries out to me. But there's no idea of, oh, but Hevel, because he was killed this way, you know, his soul. No. There's like nothing. Hevel is gone now, right? Hevel's name means that he's going to be gone, right? Don't name your kid Hevel, right? His name means he's going to be gone, and he's gone. Right? That's it. Hevel's gone, right? His blood cries out to me from the earth, because the earth is forced to cover this horrible crime, right? And it's interesting because biblically, what happens when you sin? Either you could die, right? But also there's this idea of the earth spitting you out, right? And that's not spitting you out dead, spitting you out alive, right? You're living on the earth, you're not doing the right thing, the earth's going to spit you out, right? And that's a pretty, you know, so the idea that you're causing some kind of problem in existence, right? You're causing a problem in existence because you're being immoral, right? And that's something that the land cannot tolerate, right? So you have much more of things talking about what's happening now and living now, and nothing really about, and you do have something about future generations, like, right, you can do a sin and it could be stretched out over future generations, and that could suck, right? But you don't have any sort of anything about either the way you die or what you do in your life having any sort of effect on death. And when Yechezkel talks about death, it's like everyone dies, everyone goes to the same place. The warriors, the kings, they're just all going to be sitting there in Sheol. And as Matija pointed out, elsewhere, we really see it more used as an idea, right? Death, right? Death, the grave. This is what death is, right? As opposed to a real concern with, wait, what happens afterwards? Okay, so it's and then when we talk, even if we talk about and it's interesting because what happens after death, and when for example, so Yechezkel, the dry bones, right? So people point to that, and that's fine. Traditionally, Yechezkel, the dry bones, is the source of Tchiyat HaMetim, the coming to life of the dead people in the Messianic age, and that's cool, right? If you read the plain meaning of the text in Yechezkel, what is it talking about? Those dry bones are the renewal of the nation, right? It's the renewal of the nation. Now, give me a second. I'll find the text. Okay. Yeah, this is it. Okay. Let me share my screen with just a second. We'll end with this because I don't want to go too far over. Okay. So here we have Yechezkel, the dry bones, right? And so he shows me a valley full of bones. Vayomer Elai Ben Adam, and he says to me, Ben Adam, son of man, right? He calls Yechezkel, always gets called Ben Adam, right? Vayomer Elai Ben Adam, Hatichiena hatamot ha'eleh. Will these bones live? V'omar, and I said, God, you know, atayadata, you know. Vayomer, you can see he's gotten the hang of talking to God, right? You got to ask you a question, you're like, hey. Vayomer Elai, and he said to me, Hinaveh al hatamot ha'eleh v'amarta lehem hatamot ha'yeveshot shim'u dvar Adonai. And he said to me, prophesy about these bones and say to them, these dry bones, listen to the word of God. So says the Lord God to these bones, I will bring a life within you and you shall live, or spirit within you and you shall live. And it goes on, I will put sinews on you, I'll put flesh on you, I'm going to put life in you, and you will live, and you will know that I am God, right? And I prophesied, and so as I was commanded, and when I prophesied, there was a noise, and all the bones essentially knit together, and they have and they're covered with skin, but there's still no life in them, right? And he says to Yechezkel, you call on the God's kind of call on the four winds, and so he prophesies, and breath comes into them, and they live. And they lived, and they stood on their feet, a great like army, a great number of people. All right. Vayomer Elai Ben Adam, hatamot ha'eleh kol beit Yisrael hema. These are the house of Israel. Hine omrim yavshu atzmotenu v'avdat tikvatenu nigzarnu lanu. Right? They've lost all hope. What are we talking about? We're talking about the exiles, right? They're exiled from Jerusalem, and they've lost all hope. They're like these dry bones. And God is promising, no, your hope is not lost. Like these dry bones, you shall come out of the grave. He says, Behold, hine ani potech et kivrotechem, va'aleti etchem mikivrotechem ami. I am going to open your graves. I will bring you up out of your graves, my people. Ve'veti etchem el admat Yisrael, and I shall bring you to the land of Israel. And that's when you're going to know I'm God. So what is the promise here? What is the promise here? The promise here is not, in the plain meaning of the text, the promise is not, I'm going to bring you to life. These, just like these dry bones, can come back to life if God wants it. So your hope is gone. Your bones are dry. I will put spirit back in you. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. I will open your graves because I am God and I can do this. right? So it's a beautiful idea. And the plain meaning is you as a nation will come back to life. Your bones are dry now. You have no hope now. And there's a recognition there also, by the way. There's a recognition that yes, you have lost your hope. You are dry. It's not saying, oh, they're there. There's really nothing to worry about. No. You feel like you are gone. But I am telling you, I will bring you back to life. And so this is actually it's not a statement about death. It's kind of a statement about death, in that losing hope to that extent feels like death, right? And it feels as impossible to come back from as death. But God can find a way. God will bring you back, right? God can still bring you back. And so we see that biblically, the point is much less in terms of the Hebrew Bible, again, before we get to the Second Temple period, where we do get this idea starting of the afterlife and how things are going to kind of play out. And then the afterlife is interesting. Actually, it was good to kind of go over that now, because in the Second Temple period, the idea that people come back to life at the end, that becomes the point of the afterlife. For a long time, for a while, they don't really dwell on the afterlife. The point is that the good people are going to come back to life. They're going to get their bodies back and be on earth. And that becomes the point of the afterlife it seems like for a lot of Second Temple Jewry, as opposed to simply the idea that there's going to be this ongoing life in heaven. The real point is in the final analysis to come back to earth. Again, there is that, like I said, there's at least one place where it's like, no, the earth is destroyed and all the righteous people are just going to live on in heaven, and that's it. But in general, that coming back to life on earth becomes, to a certain extent, the way that reward and punishment is gonna play out, because reward and punishment is then going to play out after they come back to life. They're going to come back to life, and then the wicked are going to be punished, and the righteous people are going to be rewarded and still live. So so I just to address Moshe Matitya's comment, he says, I always understood Yechezkel's answered Shema Tayadata as God only knows. I think the point is the Yechezkel's being careful. I think there are a couple places where Yechezkel is you can see Yechezkel's he's being careful, right? So he's being careful. God's like, can these come back to life? And he's like, God, you tell me. Like, I don't think it's God only knows, because he's talking to God, but it is kind of God only knows, right? It really is the same idea in the final analysis. But yeah, so I hope that you enjoyed that kind of putting the biblical view of Sheol and death and afterlife or lack of afterlife in kind of the context of Egypt and the ancient Near East. And thank you for joining me. And I will see you next week.